The lantern flame didn't flicker, not even when the morning sun crested the horizon, revealing the impossible, a field of blackened dead sugarcane and a missing overseer. Tobias Clark stood at the edge of the devastation he had wrought, the cracked glass of the lantern warm in his hand. He didn't know this single act of defiance would ignite a legend that would be whispered for generations. He didn't know that the fire he had started wasn't one of flame, but of spirit. But as the plantation began to stir, one question hung in the humid Louisiana air. How could one man with one lantern erase another from the face of the earth? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The year was 1838, and the air near St. Francisville, Louisiana, was a thick, wet blanket you wore from dawn till dusk. It was a suffocating humidity that clung to the skin, beaded on the brow, and made every breath feel like a sip of warm water. The scent of the Dubois plantation was a potent cocktail, the cloying sweetness of 1,000,000 sugarcane stalks baking under the relentless sun, mingled with the raw, dark perfume of turned earth and the sharp, metallic tang of sweat. It was a smell that got into your clothes, your hair, your very pores, a constant reminder of where you were and what you were. The incessant high-pitched drone of cicadas provided a maddening soundtrack to the labor, a sound so constant it became a form of silence, a wall of noise that blocked out all other thought. The cane itself, tall and dense, seemed to watch. Its rustling leaves whispered secrets in a language only the wind understood, and in the deep, dark rows, it felt as if the stalks were closing in, a living, breathing prison. In the midst of this green labyrinth, Tobias Clark moved with an economy born of years of practice. A man in his late 20s, he was built of whipcord muscle and quiet endurance. His shoulders were broad, his hands calloused and strong, capable of wielding the heavy cane knife with a precision that was almost mechanical. But his strength was a tool of his bondage, and a deep weariness had settled into him, a fatigue that went far beyond the ache in his back and the burn in his muscles. It was a weariness of the soul. While his body performed the repetitive, brutal ballet of the harvest, his eyes were never still. They were the eyes of a man who had learned to see everything and show nothing, constantly scanning, observing, taking in the subtle shifts in the mood of the field. The posture of the man next to him, the shadow of a cloud passing overhead. He was a man of deep thought and quiet observation, a dangerous combination on a place like this. The master of this oppressive world, the architect of its misery, was Overseer Finch. Finch was not a man of explosive, unpredictable rages. His cruelty was far more terrifying. It was meticulous, personal, and performed with the calm deliberation of a craftsman. He didn't just enforce the rules of Master Dubois. He seemed to derive a quiet, chilling pleasure from the act of breaking spirits. He was a slight man with a frame that seemed too delicate for the power he wielded. But his presence was a physical weight on the air. He walked the rows not with a heavy tread, but with a light, almost silent step, appearing suddenly behind a worker, his shadow falling over them like a shroud. He had a thin, cruel smile that never reached his eyes. His eyes were the color of a pale winter sky, and they missed nothing. A dropped tool, a moment of hesitation, a shared glance between husbands and wives. He walked as if he owned not just the land and the cane, but the very souls of the people who worked them, and in his mind, he did. Tobias had a secret. It was a small thing, easily concealed in the palm of his hand, but it was the repository of all the hope he had left in the world. In the stolen moments of twilight, in the cramped confines of his cabin, he had carved a small wooden bird for his wife, Eliza. It was whittled from a piece of cypress knee, the wood smooth and warm. He had spent weeks on it, using a shard of sharpened flint to render the delicate curve of its wings, the tilt of its head, the impossible lightness of its form. It wasn't just a carving, it was a promise. It was a symbol of a world beyond the cane fields, a world where things could be beautiful for their own sake, where a man could create something not for profit but for love. It was their secret language of hope, a tangible piece of a dream of freedom they whispered to each other in the dark. That afternoon the air was even heavier than usual, charged with the unspoken threat of a coming storm. Finch was on one of his inspections, his pale eyes scanning the line of workers with an unnerving intensity. Tobias felt the familiar clench in his gut as the overseer approached, his hand instinctively tightening around the small bird in his pocket. Finch stopped directly in front of him, his shadow a cold patch on Tobias's sunburnt skin. The overseer said nothing for a long moment, simply watching Tobias work, his silence a more potent tool of intimidation than any whip. Then his eyes flickered down to the slight bulge in Tobias's worn trousers. "What are you hiding there, boy?" Finch's voice was soft, almost conversational. Before Tobias could answer, Finch's hand shot out quick as a snake and plunged into his pocket, retrieving the small wooden bird. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, turning it over in the harsh sunlight. He feigned a look of admiration, a grotesque parody of appreciation twisting his thin lips. "Well now, look at this," he mused, his voice carrying to the nearby workers who had all frozen, their cane knives still. "Quite the little artist, aren't we, Tobias?" Tobias said nothing. His face was a mask of stone, his jaw set so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. He watched the bird, his promise to Eliza, resting in the hand of the man who was the living embodiment of their despair. Finch held it for another moment, letting the tension stretch until it was a screaming wire. Then, with a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, he dropped the bird to the ground. He raised his heavy, mud-caked boot and brought it down with a sickening crunch. The delicate cypress wood splintered, the lovingly carved wings shattering into unrecognizable fragments. Finch ground the pieces into the dirt for good measure before looking back up at Tobias, his pale eyes glinting with satisfaction. "Nothing beautiful grows here, Tobias," Finch said, his voice dropping back to its chillingly soft tone. "Only cane. And the only thing you need to make is profit for Master Dubois. Remember that." He turned and walked away, leaving Tobias standing over the desecrated symbol of his love. Tobias remained silent, his expression unchanged, but inside him a tempest of pure, cold rage and profound grief was unleashed. This wasn't just a broken carving. It was the violation of his heart, the deliberate crushing of the last fragile bastion of hope he and Eliza had nurtured in the darkness. The simmering resentment that had been his constant companion for years finally cooled, hardening into a shard of ice in his soul. It was a cold, unshakable resolve. Finch had made a fatal error. He had not broken Tobias's spirit, he had merely shown him that there was nothing left to lose. That night the plantation was shrouded in an inky, moonless black. The oppressive humidity of the day had given way to a thick, spectral mist that clung to the ground and muffled all sound. Tobias moved through it like a ghost, his bare feet making no noise on the damp earth. He was not headed for his own cabin, where Eliza would be waiting with a question in her eyes he could not yet answer. He was headed for the small, isolated cabin of old Joseph, the eldest enslaved person on the Dubois plantation, a man who had been there longer than the current master, longer than the cane itself, some whispered. Joseph's cabin was a world apart. It stood at the edge of the swamp, away from the neat, oppressive rows of the other quarters. The air here was different, thick with the scent of dried herbs, of wood smoke, of something ancient and mysterious. Strange, intricate carvings, symbols Tobias didn't recognize, adorned the doorframe. Inside, the oppressive weight of the plantation seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of spiritual sanctuary. Joseph sat on a low stool by the hearth, the low firelight carving deep shadows into his wizened face. He looked up as Tobias entered, his eyes cloudy with age, seeming to see far more than the young man standing before him. Tobias stood for a moment, his throat tight, the words caught behind the lump of his fury. Finally he spoke, his voice a raw, desperate whisper that was starkly loud in the quiet cabin. "I can't live under his shadow anymore, Joseph. It's a blight on the land, it poisons everything." He didn't need to say the name, there was only one shadow that long. Old Joseph was silent for a long time, studying Tobias's face in the flickering firelight. He saw the rage, but he also saw the profound grief beneath it. He saw a man pushed past his limit, a spirit stretched to its breaking point. He had seen it before, many times, but this time he saw something else, a core of resolve that was as hard and unyielding as stone. Joseph finally nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Tobias's. "Some shadows are too deep for the sun to touch," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. He spoke in the riddles and parables he was known for, a way of speaking that protected knowledge by obscuring it. They can only be burned away by a light they don't understand. He continued to study Tobias, a silent communion passing between the old man and the young one. Joseph saw the depth of the wound Finch had inflicted, and he understood that it was not a wound that could be healed with time or patience. It was a wound that demanded action. He saw the unshakable resolve in Tobias's eyes and knew that the young man would act with or without his help. And an act born of pure rage, undirected, could bring ruin upon them all. Joseph made his decision. He would guide the storm. He would give the rage a purpose, a vessel, a name. He would help. The air in the small cabin was thick with a mix of desperation, reverence, and a fragile, burgeoning hope. For the first time since he had watched Finch's boot descend, Tobias felt that the suffocating weight on his chest had lessened, if only by a fraction. A path was opening, a dark and terrifying path, but a path nonetheless. Old Joseph gestured for Tobias to sit on a small three-legged stool opposite him, the one reserved for rare and serious visitors. The fire in the hearth crackled, a lonely sound in the profound quiet of the cabin, spitting embers that glowed for a moment like angry eyes before dying on the packed earth floor. The old man moved with a deliberate slowness that spoke not of frailty but of a conservation of energy, of a life lived with intention. He reached for a small, tightly stitched leather pouch that hung from a wooden peg on the wall. He held it in his gnarled hands, the skin like ancient parchment stretched over bone, and rubbed the worn leather with his thumb as if warming it to his purpose. "What you ask for is not a simple thing," he began, his voice low and resonant, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. "It is not a curse to be thrown like a stone hoping to strike a mark. Hate is a fire that burns the one who holds it just as surely as it burns the one it is thrown at. What you must call upon is older and deeper. You must call upon justice." He paused, his cloudy eyes fixed on Tobias, letting the weight of that word settle in the small space between them. Justice was a foreign concept here, a word from a different world. "This land," Joseph continued, his hand making a slow, sweeping gesture that encompassed the cabin, the plantation, the entire world outside. "It remembers. It remembers the time before the cane choked it, before the whip scarred it into submission. It remembers the people who walked it freely, whose feet knew the soil not as a place of labor but as a home. A man like Finch, he is a sickness in that soil. His cruelty is a profound imbalance, a wound that festers and poisons everything around it. He takes and gives back only pain, sowing misery as if it were a crop. The land itself cries out against him. The ritual, therefore, is not for you, Tobias. It is not for your rage or your grief, though they are the spark. The ritual is for the land. You are to be its instrument, its voice, its hand." He carefully loosened the drawstring of the pouch and poured a small amount of its contents into his palm. The gesture was reverent, like a priest handling sacred relics. "This is not magic for killing a man," Joseph explained, his voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing Tobias to lean in closer. "It is a cleansing. It is a request, a petition for the spirits of this place, the ones who were here long before the first ship arrived and the ones of our own blood who are now buried in it, to restore the balance that has been so violently broken." He held his palm out for Tobias to see. In the dim, flickering light, Tobias could make out a coarse, earthy mixture. "Salt from the sea," Joseph said, pointing a crooked finger at the tiny, gleaming white crystals. "It is the memory of water, the great purifier. It will wash clean what has been made foul." His finger moved to a pinch of dark, rich earth, graveyard dirt, from the resting place of your own grandmother, Sarah. It is your connection, your lineage. It gives you the right to speak for the ancestors, to call on their strength and their sorrow. You do not act alone when you carry this. Finally, he indicated a collection of dark, fibrous specks like crushed and dried splinters. "And these are the roots of the whisperwood tree, which grows only in the deepest part of the swamp where the sun never touches the ground. They know the secrets of darkness and light, of life and decay. They hold the power of transition, of moving a thing from one state to another." Joseph carefully poured the potent mixture back into the pouch and pulled the drawstring tight. He handed it to Tobias. The leather was cool and smooth against his palm, yet it seemed to thrum with a latent energy. "The lantern is the final piece," Joseph said, his eyes locking with Tobias's, their intensity belying their age. "It must be his, the one he carries, the one that lights his path of cruelty. It is already filled with his presence, his foul energy. It will be the vessel for your intention. The flame will be your voice, carrying your will, carrying the will of the land and the ancestors out into the world. You ain't calling on hate, boy. You are reminding the world what justice is. But be warned, when you call on such a power, you cannot always control how it answers." The next day was a torment of anticipation. The world, which had always been a blur of green cane, brown dirt, and blue sky, sharpened into a terrifying clarity. Tobias was no longer just a laborer going through the motions, he was a hunter, and every detail of his environment was now a part of his stalk. He observed Overseer Finch not with fear or resentment, but with a new, predatory focus. He watched the way Finch paused at the end of a row, the way he hooked his thumbs in his belt, the way his eyes scanned the workers with a proprietary air. He was memorizing the man's habits, searching for the precise moment of opportunity. The lantern, which usually hung from a hook on Finch's saddle or sat on his desk, became the focal point of Tobias's entire existence. It was a simple tin and glass object, but now it seemed to glow with a malevolent significance, a symbol of the authority and terror that Finch wielded. It was the eye of the storm, and Tobias knew he had to walk into it. He noted with a surge of adrenaline that made his heart hammer against his ribs that Finch had an unvarying routine. Every evening, as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, Finch would leave the fields and go to his small office, a standalone shack near the main house. And every evening he would leave his lantern, freshly filled with oil, on a thick wooden post just outside the door while he went inside to take his supper and write his reports for Master Dubois. It was an act of supreme confidence, of arrogance. It never occurred to him that anyone would dare touch his property. That lantern on its post was a declaration. It said that his power was so absolute it needed no guard. Tobias knew this was his moment. The plan, which had been a desperate, whispered thing in the dark of Joseph's cabin, was now hardening into a terrifying reality. The thought of it made his mouth go dry and his palms sweat. This was the threshold. To take the lantern was to step across a line from which there could be no return. He would no longer be a victim of circumstance, a man things happened to. He would become an agent of his own design, a shaper of his own fate, for better or for worse. The fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but beneath it the ice of his resolve was colder still. He thought of Eliza's face, of the splintered wood of the bird ground into the dirt, and the fear became a tool, a whetstone against which he sharpened his purpose. The night fell like a black velvet shroud, thick and moonless and utterly silent. A low-lying fog coiled through the cane rows, muffling the world in a damp, ghostly embrace. Tobias slipped from his cabin, a shadow among shadows. He moved with a certainty that belied the frantic beating of his heart, his bare feet making no sound on the path. He reached the overseer's office and saw it, the lantern sitting on its post. Its untrimmed wick cast a small, greasy yellow halo in the oppressive dark, a lone point of light in a world consumed by shadow. The office window was lit, and he could see Finch's silhouette at his desk. Tobias's breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to go back to his cabin and forget this madness. But the image of the crushed bird flashed in his mind, and his hand was steady as he reached out. His fingers closed around the cool metal handle of the lantern. Lifting it from the post was the single heaviest act of his life. He half expected an alarm to sound, for shouts to erupt from the darkness. But there was nothing. Only the chirping of crickets and the frantic thumping of his own blood in his ears. He held the lantern, Finch's lantern, in his hand. It was done. The bridge was burned. He turned and melted back into the fog, into the waiting, watchful arms of the cane field. He walked deep into the field, far from the paths, to a place that was seared into his memory and the memory of his community. It was a small, unnatural clearing, a place where the cane refused to grow thick, where the ground was hard-packed and barren. It was a place Finch favored for his punishments, a makeshift amphitheater of pain where screams were swallowed by the rustling leaves. The air here was thick and still, heavy with the ghosts of past agonies. This, Tobias knew, was the place. This was where the imbalance was most acute. He set the lantern down in the center of the clearing. His hands trembled as he took out the leather pouch from his pocket. With the reverence of a prayer, he began the ritual. He lit the lantern's wick, the small flame sputtering to life, a fragile defiance against the overwhelming dark. Then, as the flame grew steadier, he began to feed the mixture old Joseph had given him into the lantern's small metal vents at the top. He sprinkled the salt, the graveyard dirt, the crushed roots of the whisperwood into the rising heat. As the grains touched the hot metal, they didn't burn, they seemed to dissolve, turning into a vapor that was drawn down into the glass housing, into the flame itself. And as he did, he began to whisper. He whispered the names of his ancestors, names that stretched back to a land he had never seen. He whispered the name of his grandmother, Sarah, whose bones lay in the plantation's small, neglected graveyard. He whispered the names of those who had suffered in this very clearing. Men and women whose backs had been laid open by Finch's whip. He whispered Eliza's name, a prayer for her safety. He poured all his grief, his rage, his desperate, aching love for his wife into the flame. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The flame inside the lantern began to change. It flared, and the common yellow color bled away, replaced by a pale, ethereal blue-green glow. It was the color of swamp gas, of moonlight on still water, of something not of the living world. The flame ceased to flicker. It burned with an unnatural, steady intensity, a solid, unwavering spear of light that seemed to consume no oil. It cast strange, elongated shadows that seemed to dance and writhe with a life of their own, twisting into shapes that were independent of the cane stalks that surrounded them. The clearing was filled with a silent, pulsing luminescence. Finch, inside his office, discovered his lantern missing with a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. It was not the value of the object. It was the audacity. It was a challenge to his authority, an act of insolence so profound it was almost unthinkable. Assuming it was a simple, foolish act of theft, he grabbed his heavy leather whip from its hook by the door and stormed out into the night. He would make an example of the thief, an example that would be remembered for a generation. He scanned the darkness and then he saw it, a faint, otherworldly glow, pulsing from deep within the cane field. It was a strange light, not the warm yellow of his lantern, but he followed it, his fury mounting with every step. He burst into the clearing and stopped dead. He found Tobias standing calmly in the center of the eerie blue-green light, holding the glowing lantern. Finch's rage peaked, blinding him to the strangeness of the scene. All he saw was the thief, his property, and the ultimate act of defiance. "You will pay for this, boy," he snarled, his voice a low growl. He took a step forward, raising the whip. "I will strip the skin from your back until your ribs show." Tobias didn't flinch. He didn't cower or beg. He simply stood his ground, his face illuminated by the lantern's unholy light, his expression one of serene, sorrowful resolve. He held the lantern up slightly, not as a weapon, but as a statement. "Your time in this field is over, Mr. Finch," he said, his voice quiet, yet it carried in the unnatural stillness with the finality of a judge's sentence. As he spoke, the light from the lantern pulsed, a silent heartbeat of power growing brighter, and the humid Louisiana air grew suddenly, unnaturally cold. Finch, a man who had never known fear, a man who dealt it out as a daily currency, felt a cold, sharp prickle of it trace a line down his spine. He looked from Tobias's calm face to the impossible light, and for the first time in his life the overseer was afraid. The light did not burn Finch with heat, it did not sear his skin or set his clothes ablaze. It was a fire of a different nature, a spiritual conflagration that ignored the physical world, to strike at the essence of the man himself. The ethereal blue-green glow pulsed from the lantern, and instead of radiating outward, it seemed to coalesce, to pour through the air in a silent, shimmering wave that passed directly through the overseer's body. For a moment, Finch simply stood there, his whip still raised, his face a mask of confusion. He looked down at his own hands, then back at Tobias, as if trying to comprehend a trick of the light. The initial prickle of fear was now blooming into a full-grown flower of terror, his mind unable to process the sensory information it was receiving. The air was frigid, yet he was not cold. A brilliant light was passing through him, yet he was not burned. Then the land itself began to react. In a perfect, razor-sharp circle around Tobias and the lantern, the sugarcane began to die. It was not a slow withering, it was an instantaneous event. A draining of life so swift and total it was horrifying to behold. The vibrant green stalks, heavy with the promise of sugar and profit, turned a deep, velvety black, the color of charcoal, the color of a starless midnight sky. The leaves curled in on themselves, crumbling into a fine, dry dust that the wind, which had suddenly begun to moan through the clearing, picked up and swirled around them. It was a cold wind, a wind that carried the scent of deep earth and forgotten graves, and it seemed to speak a low, mournful sound that was part grief and part judgment. Finch's confusion gave way to raw, primal panic. He finally understood, not with his mind but with his soul, that he was in the presence of a power that was ancient and utterly beyond his comprehension. He opened his mouth and let out a scream, a sound that was sharp and high and filled with the terror of a man seeing his own damnation. But the scream was abruptly cut off, not as if he had stopped, but as if the sound itself had been swallowed by the moaning wind, erased from existence before it could travel more than a few feet. The light, having passed through him, having done its work, began to recede. It flowed backward, a river of pale light returning to its source, pouring back into the glass housing of the lantern until only the steady blue-green flame remained. Tobias stood alone in the perfect circle of blackened, dead cane. The wind died down, and the oppressive silence of the Louisiana night rushed back in, heavier than before. Of Overseer Finch there was no sign, no body, no scorch mark, no trace that he had ever been there at all. He was simply gone. Tobias looked down at the lantern in his hand. A fine, spidery crack had appeared on the glass, branching out from the center like a frozen lightning strike, a physical testament to the immense unseen power that had just been unleashed. But inside, the flame burned on as steady and as silent as ever. The next morning broke humid and bright, the sun climbing into a sky of washed-out blue. The field hands were sent out at dawn, as they always were, their bodies moving with the slow, weary rhythm of long habit. It was a young man named Samuel, no more than 17, who was the first to see it. He was working the edge of the field near the swamp when he came upon the clearing. He stopped, his cane knife hanging limply in his hand. The sight was so impossible, so contrary to the laws of nature as he knew them, that for a moment his mind refused to accept it. A perfect circle of black, dead cane standing in stark contrast to the vibrant green of the rest of the field. In the very center of the circle, sitting on a tree stump, was a lantern, and from this distance he could see that its flame was still burning, a tiny point of light defying the full glare of the morning sun. He took a hesitant step closer, and then another. There was no smell of smoke, no sign of a physical fire. The ground was not scorched, it was simply wrong. He saw the fine layer of black dust that coated the ground within the circle, and a cold dread washed over him. He opened his mouth and screamed. His cry, unlike Finch's, carried across the fields, a raw note of pure terror that brought the work to an abrupt halt. One by one, then in small groups, the other field hands abandoned their rows and came to see. They gathered at the edge of the unnatural circle, a silent, growing crowd, their faces a mixture of profound terror and a dawning, dangerous awe. They saw what Samuel had seen, the perfectly circular patch of devastation, the complete lack of any physical evidence of a fire or a struggle. And they all saw the impossible centerpiece of the scene, the overseer's lantern sitting on its stump, its flame burning as brightly and steadily as if it had just been lit. Whispers spread through the crowd like a contagion, a wildfire of speculation and fear. It was unnatural. It was the work of spirits. Some crossed themselves, muttering prayers under their breath, terrified of the retribution that was sure to come from the main house. What devilry was this? What new horror had been visited upon them? But others, the older ones, the ones who remembered the stories of their grandparents, felt a different emotion stirring in their chests. It was a feeling they had not allowed themselves to feel for a very long time, a dangerous spark of hope. They looked at the impossible scene not as a work of the devil, but as a sign, an answer to a prayer they had forgotten they'd made. Justice. The word was not spoken, but it hung in the air, a silent, electrifying thought that passed from one person to another through shared, knowing glances. They looked at the empty clearing, at the lantern that had belonged to the man who had caused them so much pain, and they felt not fear, but a deep, trembling sense of vindication. The land itself had passed judgment. It was nearly an hour before word reached the main house and Master Dubois was called to the scene. He arrived on a magnificent black stallion, a man whose fine clothes and polished boots were an insult to the muddy field he now entered. Jean-Paul Dubois was a pragmatic man, a man of business. He had inherited the plantation from his father and had doubled its profits in 10 years. He saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, of profit and loss. He saw the enslaved people who worked his land not as human beings but as a particularly troublesome type of livestock, a necessary component of his vast and complicated business operation. As he dismounted at the edge of the clearing, his face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He did not see a supernatural event, he saw a costly and infuriating disruption of his operations. That circle of blackened cane was a circle of lost revenue. The missing overseer was a significant logistical problem, a disruption to the chain of command that kept his profits flowing. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice sharp and cutting, directed at his second in command, a nervous man named Moreau. Moreau wrung his hands, his eyes wide with the same superstitious fear as the field hands. We do not know, Master Dubois. We found it this way. Finch, he is gone." Dubois strode to the edge of the black circle, his expensive boots stopping just short of the line of dead cane. He inspected the scene with the cold, analytical eye of a man assessing damaged goods. He noted the perfect circular shape, the lack of scorch marks, the fine black dust. He saw the lantern still burning, and a flicker of irritation crossed his face. It was an anomaly, a detail that did not fit, and he despised things that did not fit. He turned his furious gaze on the assembled crowd of enslaved people who shrank back under his scrutiny. "Who did this?" he snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "Who is responsible?" Silence. The crowd was a wall of terrified, unblinking faces. They knew nothing, and they knew everything. Their fear of Dubois was immense, a lifetime of conditioned response, but their fear of the power that had done this was greater still. Dubois' eyes scanned the crowd, moving from one face to the next, searching for a flicker of guilt, a sign of knowledge. His gaze swept past women clutching their children, past old men whose faces were already maps of suffering, and then it landed on Tobias. Tobias was standing at the back of the crowd, slightly apart from the others. He had carefully composed his face into a mask of weary, bovine ignorance, the same expression he wore every day in the fields. He met the master's gaze for a fraction of a second, his own eyes empty, his posture one of simple, dumbfounded curiosity. There was nothing to see, nothing to suggest that he was the epicenter of this entire impossible event. But Dubois' eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than the others, a flicker of suspicion in their cold depths. He saw a stillness in Tobias, a lack of the overt, trembling fear that marked the others. It was a dissonant note in the chorus of terror, and Dubois filed it away. He turned back to Moreau, his voice low and venomous, meant only for his subordinates' ears, but Tobias, with his heightened senses, heard every word. "Find him," Dubois hissed, his jaw tight with fury. "I don't care what it takes. Take the dogs, search the swamps, the woods, every cabin on this plantation and the next. I want Finch found, dead or alive, and find out what did this." He gestured angrily at the circle of black cane. "This is not just a missing man, this is an attack on my property. This is an act of rebellion. This is an expensive mystery, Moreau, and I intend to solve it, whatever the cost." He turned and strode back to his horse, his back rigid with a fury that promised a terrible reckoning to come. The spark of hope that had flickered in the hearts of the enslaved was now threatened by the shadow of the master's wrath. The investigation began with a fury that matched Master Dubois' own. Men on horseback, their faces grim and determined, fanned out from the main house, the leather of their saddles creaking in the humid air. Moreau, desperate to redeem himself in his master's eyes, led the charge, his voice sharp with an authority he didn't feel. They brought the dogs, lean, hungry animals with a reputation for finding any man who tried to run. But the moment the dogs reached the edge of the blackened circle, they began to whine and tuck their tails between their legs. They refused to cross the line, their animal senses recoiling from a wrongness that the men could not see. They paced nervously along the perimeter, their hackles raised, sniffing at the air with confused, frightened yelps before turning back toward the familiar green of the living cane, refusing to enter the dead zone. For days, the search parties scoured the surrounding swamps and forests. They plunged into the murky, cypress-choked water, their horses struggling through the thick mud. They beat the bushes and shouted Finch's name until their throats were raw. They found nothing. No tracks leading away from the field, no shred of torn clothing, no sign of a struggle in the swamp, and most unnervingly, no body. It was as if the man had simply evaporated from the face of the earth. The search became a grim, futile exercise, and the men returned each evening covered in mud and mosquito bites, their faces etched with a growing unease. The story of the unexplainable circle and the spooked dogs spread to neighboring plantations, carried by the wind and whispered from one person to another. Back on the Dubois plantation, the blackened circle in the cane field became a taboo place, a haunted monument to an impossible event. No one dared approach it. The field hands gave it a wide berth, their eyes skittering away from it as if a direct gaze might invite its curse upon them. Even the birds seemed to avoid flying over it. It sat under the Louisiana sun, a perfect dark wound in the green flesh of the earth, a constant silent reminder of the power that had been unleashed. With every passing day, Master Dubois' frustration mounted. The loss of an overseer was an inconvenience, but the loss of productivity was an outrage. The fear and awe that had settled over his workforce had slowed the pace of the harvest to a crawl. He saw it in the hesitant movements, the constant glances toward the haunted field, the way they gathered in hushed groups when they thought no one was watching. Every day the mystery remained unsolved was another day of lost profits, another entry of red ink in his ledger. And Jean-Paul Dubois hated nothing more than red ink. In the suffocating privacy of their small, windowless cabin, Eliza confronted him. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and fear. She had waited for days, her terror a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She was an intelligent and perceptive woman, and she had seen the change in her husband. She had seen him return in the dead of night after Finch's disappearance, his clothes damp with dew, his eyes holding a strange, distant look she had never seen before. She had heard the whispers in the rows, the way the other enslaved people now looked at Tobias, a mixture of awe and terror in their eyes. They were whispering his name, connecting him to the impossible event. She waited until the small fire in their hearth had burned down to glowing embers, until the plantation was wrapped in a blanket of exhausted silence. "What did you do, Tobias?" Her voice was a terrified whisper, barely audible even in the small space. She clutched a thin blanket to her chest, her knuckles white. "What did you do? They're saying your name in the rows. They say you called on something. They say you have the devil's light." Her eyes, wide and dark in the dim light, filled with tears. "They will hang you for this, Tobias. They will hang you, and they will make us all watch." Tobias reached for her, but she flinched away, a small, involuntary movement that cut him deeper than any whip. He saw the genuine terror in her face, and the terrible isolation of his position crashed down upon him. He had acted to protect her, to avenge the violation of the love they shared, and in doing so he had placed her in the center of a terrifying storm. He tried to comfort her, his voice low and urgent, but the words felt hollow even to him. "It wasn't the devil, Eliza. It was justice. It was for us." He gestured vaguely, his hand shaking slightly. "It was for the bird he crushed, for every lash he ever gave to me, to anyone. He was a poison, and the land cleansed itself of him." His own certainty was shaken by the magnitude of what had happened. In the dark of Joseph's cabin it had felt righteous, necessary. But now, seeing the fear in his wife's eyes, hearing the dogs baying in the distance, feeling the weight of the master's fury settling over the entire plantation, he felt a tremor of doubt. He could not share the full truth of the supernatural event with her. How could he explain a flame that did not burn, a power that erased a man from the world? It was a truth so far beyond their reality that it would sound like the ravings of a madman. And so he was trapped, unable to give her the comfort of a logical explanation, unable to share the terrible, magnificent burden of what he had done. He had acted to protect their shared hope, and now he was utterly alone with the consequences. The days that followed saw the enslaved community fracture under the pressure. The invisible lines of trust and kinship that held them together began to fray. Some, the ones who had suffered most directly under Finch's cruelty, looked at Tobias with a new, fearful respect. He became a figure of power, a quiet hero who had done the impossible. They would not meet his eye, but he would find small tokens of their gratitude left near his cabin door in the mornings: a ripe mango, a small, intricately woven grass bracelet, a handful of pecans. They were small, silent acts of solidarity, acknowledgments of the blow he had struck against their shared oppression. Others, however, saw him as a profound danger. They were the cautious ones, the ones who believed that survival lay in invisibility, in bending so you did not break. To them, Tobias had not brought justice. He had brought the focused, analytical wrath of Master Dubois down upon them all. They avoided him, hurrying past his cabin and pulling their children close, their faces tight with accusation. They saw the failed searches, the master's mounting frustration, and they knew that a price would be demanded. A scapegoat would be found. They feared that Tobias, in his act of defiance, had signed all their death warrants. From this soil of fear and division, a new antagonist began to grow. His name was Hector, a man whose ambition was as sharp as a freshly honed cane knife. Hector had always been one to curry favor with the overseers, offering information, working harder when they were watching, positioning himself for the small privileges that could make life marginally less unbearable. He had despised Finch's cruelty, but he had respected his power. Now, with Finch gone, he saw a vacuum, and in Tobias he saw both a threat and an opportunity. He watched Tobias with a keen, calculating eye, his gaze missing nothing. He saw the small gifts left at the cabin door. He saw the fear and the reverence in the eyes of the others. He listened to the whispers, the fragments of rumor and speculation that swirled through the fields and the quarters, and he began to piece them together. He did not believe in spirits or ancient justice. He believed in power, and he saw that a new kind of power was coalescing around Tobias. Hector decided that if he could be the one to expose it, to explain the mystery to Master Dubois, he could elevate himself far beyond his current station. He began to watch Tobias not as a fellow bondsman, but as a problem to be solved, a key to his own advancement. The weight of it all, the fear in Eliza's eyes, the divided community, the unseen threat of Hector's ambition, and the constant simmering pressure of Dubois' investigation became an unbearable burden. Tobias felt as if he were walking on a wire stretched over a pit of fire. He needed guidance. He needed to understand the nature of the power he had unleashed. Under the cloak of another moonless night, he made his way back to the isolated cabin at the edge of the swamp. He found old Joseph sitting by his hearth just as before, but the old man looked different. He seemed smaller, more frail. The ritual had taken a toll on him as well, as if he had lent his own life force to the working of it. Joseph looked up as Tobias entered, and his ancient eyes were filled with a grave, sorrowful light. He knew why the young man had come. "You feel it, don't you?" Joseph's voice was a dry rasp. The silence, the watching. Tobias nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "The spirit you called," Joseph said, his voice heavy with warning. "It ain't a dog you can whistle back to your heel. It is a power of the earth, as old as the stones and as hungry as the fire. It answered your call for justice because the wound you showed it was deep and festering. It cleansed the field of Finch, as you asked. But such things once woken have their own hunger. They are forces of balance, and they will continue to seek it." He leaned forward, his expression more serious than Tobias had ever seen it. It did not go back to sleep, boy. It is still here. It is still watching. It tasted the imbalance in Finch, and it consumed him. Now it lingers, drawn to the echoes of its own work. Be careful it don't turn its gaze on you, or on those you love. Your act of justice has left a mark on you, a scent that the spirit can follow. You are tied to it now. The power that saved you can just as easily destroy you. The words hung in the air, a new layer of danger settling over Tobias. The fear of the master's whip and the hangman's noose was a familiar one. This was something else entirely, a danger that was formless, unpredictable, and absolute. The power itself was a volatile, untamed force. Master Dubois' patience, a commodity he possessed in far smaller quantities than land or people, had finally evaporated. The futile search for Finch, the mounting losses from the stalled harvest, and the unnerving, silent defiance of his workforce had coalesced into a cold, hard knot of rage in his chest. He had sent a letter by fast rider to New Orleans, a letter that cost him a significant sum, a letter that summoned a specialist. He arrived without fanfare, a man who seemed to absorb the light around him. His name was Gideon, and his reputation preceded him like a cold shadow. He was not an overseer, he was a professional slave breaker, a man whose entire trade was the methodical deconstruction of the human will. He was the final, brutal answer to any question of rebellion. Gideon was the stark antithesis of the superstitious, fear-riddled community he now entered. Where they saw spirits and curses, he saw leverage points and psychological flaws. He was a man of chilling, dispassionate logic. He was of average height and build, dressed in clean, practical clothes that seemed immune to the dust and grime of the plantation. His hands were unnervingly clean, his nails immaculate, as if he never touched the world he was paid to manipulate. But it was his eyes that truly defined him. They were the color of slate, dead, flat, and utterly emotionless. They did not look at people, they assessed them, cataloging weaknesses and calculating the precise application of pain required to achieve a desired result. He arrived not with a whip in his hand, but with a small leather-bound notebook, and that was infinitely more terrifying. He listened to Master Dubois' furious, rambling account of the impossible events with a profound, unnerving stillness, his face betraying no hint of skepticism or surprise. When Dubois was finished, Gideon simply nodded once, a small, sharp movement of his head. "I will handle it," he said, and the quiet certainty in his voice was more menacing than any threat. Gideon's first act was to do nothing at all. He did not bother with the haunted field, dismissing it with a glance as an irrelevant theatricality. He did not interrogate the search parties or study the baffled dogs. He observed the people. For 2 days, he simply walked the plantation, his movements slow and deliberate, his slate-gray eyes missing nothing. He watched the field hands, noting the subtle hierarchies, the bonds of family, the currents of fear and resentment that flowed between them. He was like an engineer studying a complex machine, learning its functions before attempting a repair. And very quickly his dispassionate gaze settled on Tobias Clark. He saw the way the others gave him a wide berth, the way their eyes would either slide away from him in fear or follow him with a look of fearful reverence. He saw the small, secret gifts that appeared near his cabin. He saw a man who was not leading a rebellion but had become the unwilling center of a powerful new belief system. Gideon understood that to crush the belief, he first had to isolate and crush the symbol. His campaign began not with a bang, but with a slow, tightening squeeze. He did not touch Tobias, he did not speak to him. Instead, he began a campaign of meticulous psychological warfare aimed at the entire community, designed to make them tear their own hero down. The workloads, already brutal, were increased by 1/3. The midday meal was eliminated, and the evening rations of cornmeal and salt pork were cut in half. The single day of rest, Sunday, was canceled. The plantation became a landscape of gnawing hunger and bone, deep exhaustion. When a small delegation of older men dared to approach him to ask why, Gideon's answer was calm and cold. "Your privileges have been suspended," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "They will be returned when the troublemaker who has brought this curse upon you is identified and brought to me. Your suffering is a debt owed by one of your own. You may thank him for it." He twisted the knife with an artist's precision. He singled out Eliza for the most grueling, soul-crushing tasks. She was taken from the fields and put to work in the main yard, directly under the sun, sorting through mounds of cotton for hours on end, a task that was both physically exhausting and mind-numbingly tedious. Then she was moved to the smokehouse, forced to carry heavy loads of wood and tend the fires, the heat and smoke leaving her gasping for breath, her clothes perpetually stained with soot. Gideon would often stand at a distance, sometimes from the veranda of the main house, sometimes just at the edge of the yard, making no secret of the fact that he was watching her. But his true target was Tobias. He would watch Tobias in the fields, see the man's gaze drift constantly toward the yard, see the muscles in his jaw clench, see the agony in his eyes as he watched his wife suffer for his actions. It was a masterful stroke of cruelty. Gideon was using Tobias's love for his wife, the very thing that had driven him to act, as the lever to break him. Every evening when Tobias and Eliza returned to their cabin, the silence between them was thick with unspoken pain. Eliza's hands were raw, her face smudged with soot, her body trembling with exhaustion. She no longer looked at him with accusation, but with a deep, hollow despair that was far worse. Tobias's act of justice had become a cage, and it was slowly crushing the person he loved most. Hector saw it all. He saw the community's growing desperation, the hunger that was turning their fear of Tobias into a sharp, resentful anger. He saw the focused, methodical pressure Gideon was applying, and he saw the torment in Tobias's eyes. He knew the time was right. His ambition, a sharp and hungry thing, finally overrode his fear. One evening, as dusk was settling over the plantation, he slipped away from the quarters and made his way to the small office that Gideon had claimed as his own. He approached the door with his heart hammering in his chest, a mixture of terror and exhilaration flooding his veins. He knocked softly. The door opened and Gideon stood there, his face an impassive mask in the lamplight. He looked at Hector, then simply stepped aside, a silent invitation to enter. The office was sparse and clean. The only things on the desk were Gideon's notebook and a single lit candle. Hector stood twisting his worn hat in his hands, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding Gideon's steady, unnerving gaze. "Master Gideon, sir," he began, his voice a nervous stammer. I have information about the trouble." Gideon said nothing. He simply waited, his silence a vacuum that demanded to be filled. Hector swallowed hard and plunged ahead, the words tumbling out of him in a rushed whisper. He told Gideon what he had seen, what he had pieced together from the whispers. "It's Tobias Clark, sir, but it ain't just him. He didn't act alone." He paused, seeing a flicker of interest, the first he had ever seen in Gideon's dead eyes. This was the key. Gideon was a man of logic. He would not believe one man could make another vanish. He needed a conspiracy, a network, a rational explanation. "The night before Finch disappeared," Hector continued, his voice gaining confidence, "Tobias went to see old Joseph. He was in his cabin for a long time." He leaned forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "The old man, he deals in roots and spirits. He's a hoodoo man. Everyone knows it. Everyone's afraid of him. Tobias went to him with hate in his heart. Joseph gave him the means. Joseph is the root of this poison." Hector felt a thrill of power as he saw the pieces click into place behind Gideon's eyes. He had given the logician a logical path. He had given him a tangible target that was not a ghost or a spirit, but a man. "If you want the snake," Hector concluded, his voice filled with a triumphant certainty, "you must first find the nest." Gideon acted on the information with the swift, brutal efficiency that was his trademark. The next afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, tired shadows across the plantation, his men, a grim, hand-picked group from another estate, moved. They stormed old Joseph's cabin at the edge of the swamp, dragging the old man out into the harsh sunlight. Joseph offered no resistance, his face a mask of ancient, sorrowful resignation, as if he had been expecting this moment his entire life. They dragged him to the center of the main yard, the same yard where Eliza had been toiling, and tied him to the thick, dark, stained wood of the whipping post. The work horn blew, an unusual, urgent summons that brought everyone from the fields, their hearts pounding with a nameless dread. They were herded into the yard, a silent, terrified mass of people, their eyes fixed on the frail figure of old Joseph, his back straight, his head held high against the rough wood of the post. Gideon waited until every last person was assembled. He stood before them, his clean clothes a stark contrast to their sweat-stained rags, his face as calm and composed as if he were about to read a passage from a book. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it was clear and cold, and it cut through the humid air, reaching every corner of the yard. "This man," he said, gesturing to old Joseph with a casual flick of his hand, "is a poison. He has filled your heads with superstitious nonsense and has brought a curse on this plantation. He is the architect of the crime that has cost you your rest and your food. I will have the truth of what happened to Mr. Finch." He paused, his slate-gray eyes sweeping across the crowd, making each person feel as if he were looking directly into their soul. "Unless the one responsible for the disappearance of Mr. Finch and the destruction of the cane confesses by sundown," he declared, his voice dropping to a chilling conversational tone, "I will whip this old man to death. His life is now in the hands of the guilty." A wave of pure collective horror rippled through the crowd. A low moan of despair rose from 100 throats. This was a cruelty beyond even what they had known under Finch. To be forced to watch the slow, agonizing death of a beloved elder. To know that one among them held the power to stop it, it was a form of torture more profound than any physical lash. And then, as one, every eye in the yard filled with a terrible mixture of fear, accusation, and desperate pleading pity turned to Tobias. He stood frozen, the world narrowing to a single point. He saw Eliza's face in the crowd, her beautiful features streaked with tears and dust, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea, begging him to do something, to stop this nightmare. He was trapped. The path he had chosen in the dark of the cane field, the path of justice, had led him here to this impossible choice. His secret act to save his own soul had led to the imminent public and unjust death of the very man who had helped him. The net had not just closed, it had wrapped itself around his throat. The sun, a great bleeding orb of orange and purple, touched the horizon, its last rays painting the underside of the clouds in hues of fire and blood. The deadline had arrived. The air in the yard was thick enough to drink, a cocktail of fear, humidity, and the metallic scent of impending violence. Gideon stood impassive, a statue carved from cold ambition, his hand resting lightly on the coiled leather of the whip at his belt. All eyes were on Tobias, 100 pairs of eyes, each a mirror of his own impossible choice. He saw the accusation, the pity, the desperate, silent plea. He saw Eliza, her face a pale beacon of anguish in the gathering gloom, her hands pressed to her mouth as if to hold back a scream. And he saw old Joseph tied to the post, his frail body looking impossibly small, yet his spirit unbent. His ancient eyes meeting Tobias's across the yard with a look not of fear but of profound, sorrowful understanding. In that moment, all the turmoil within Tobias, the rage, The fear, the crushing weight of his secret simply fell away. It was replaced by a profound, sorrowful calm, a clarity so absolute it was almost peaceful. He had tried to seize justice for himself, and in doing so had brought injustice upon an innocent man. The path was clear. Just as the last sliver of the sun dipped below the tree line, plunging the yard into twilight, Tobias took a step forward. "I did it." The words were not a mumbled confession, not a whisper of defeat. They were a declaration, spoken in a voice that was clear, steady, and carried across the tense silence of the yard with the resonance of a struck bell. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Eliza's sob was a sharp, wounded sound in the sudden quiet. Gideon, the master manipulator, allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. The barest upward twitch of his thin lips. He had won. He had found the fracture point and applied the perfect pressure. He gestured for his men to seize Tobias. But Tobias did not surrender. He did not wait for the chains. Instead, with a strange, unreadable confidence, he turned his back on Gideon, on the whipping post, on the entire terrified assembly, and began to walk. His steps were not hurried, but they were filled with an undeniable purpose. He walked directly towards the haunted blackened cane field. The crowd, caught between their fear of Gideon and their awe of Tobias, parted before him like water before a ship's prow. Gideon's men hesitated, looking to their master for instruction. Gideon's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. This was not part of his calculation. He barked an order, "Follow him," and he, along with his men and the entire silent, mesmerized population of the Dubois plantation, followed Tobias as he walked with the calm certainty of a king approaching his throne. He walked to the edge of the dead circle, and without a moment's hesitation, stepped across the unseen line into the blighted ground. He walked to the very center of the circle of devastation and stopped before the stump. He bent down and picked up the lantern. Impossibly, after all this time, the pale blue-green flame within still burned, its steady, otherworldly light casting his strong features in a ghostly glow. Tobias turned, the lantern held in one hand, its cracked glass seeming to gather the last vestiges of the twilight and amplify them. He faced Gideon, who had stopped at the edge of the circle, his men arrayed behind him, their bravado faltering in the face of this quiet, inexplicable scene. The crowd formed a wide, silent ring around the clearing, their faces a sea of pale, upturned ovals in the gloom. "You want to know what happened to the overseer?" Tobias's voice was different now, imbued with an authority that did not come from any earthly master. It was the voice of the wind, of the ancient earth. He was not murdered. He was judged. He was weighed against the pain he caused, the spirits he broke, the hope he crushed. He was weighed, and the land found him wanting. Gideon's face was a mask of cold fury and disbelief. "Hoodoo nonsense," he spat, regaining his composure. "You will tell me how you did it. You will confess your conspiracy, and you will hang." Tobias ignored him. He held the lantern aloft, its strange light illuminating his resolute face. He was no longer just Tobias Clark, husband of Eliza, worker of Cain. He was something more, an anchor point for a power he was only just beginning to understand. And he began to chant. These were not the words old Joseph had taught him, the words of petition, of calling forth. These were new words, words that poured from the deepest part of his soul, a spontaneous liturgy of sacrifice. He chanted for Eliza's safety, a shield of love to wrap around her. He chanted for old Joseph's freedom, a debt of honor to be paid. He chanted for his community, for the children who had never known a day without fear, for the old ones who had forgotten what hope felt like. He was not asking for destruction now. He was offering himself, his life, his spirit in exchange for their safety. He was taking the full weight of the power he had summoned, the power that lingered and watched and pulling it into himself to become its vessel and its final meal. He poured his will, his love, his grief, and his unshakable resolve into the flame. The lantern's light responded. The pale blue-green glow, the color of judgment and decay, began to shift. It brightened, the color washing out, transforming into a blinding, pure white light. It was the color of lightning, of the heart of a star, a light so intense it seemed to vibrate, to sing a high, silent note that resonated in the bones. It was a light that cast no shadows, a light that seemed to erase the very concept of darkness. It flared outward from the lantern, a silent, beautiful, terrifying explosion of pure white energy. The light did not burn, it did not harm. But it struck the assembled crowd with a wave of pure psychic force. It was a light that bypassed the eyes and shone directly into the soul, revealing every fear, every secret sorrow, every hidden shame. Gideon, the man of cold logic and emotionless calculation, cried out, a raw, animal sound of terror, as his carefully constructed world of cause and effect was shattered into a million pieces. His mind, which had never known a mystery it could not solve with pain, was suddenly flooded with an ocean of pure, unreasoning dread. He and his men staggered back, shielding their eyes not from a physical brightness but from an internal one, a light that showed them the hollowness of their own souls. The horses tied at the edge of the yard screamed in panic, their animal senses overwhelmed. They reared, their eyes rolling white, snapping their tethers and bolting into the darkness. An unnatural, powerful gust of wind born from nowhere tore through the yard, a physical manifestation of the spiritual chaos. It kicked up a blinding storm of dust, leaves, and debris, a swirling vortex that momentarily obscured everything from view. The crowd cried out, cowering, turning their faces away from the wind and the terrifying, soul-searing light. The world became a maelstrom of sound and fury, of screaming men and panicked horses, of a howling wind and a light that promised to unmake reality itself. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The wind died down to a whisper. The blinding white light vanished, plunging the clearing into a profound, disorienting darkness. The dust began to settle. One by one, the people lowered their arms, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They blinked, their eyes adjusting to the gloom, and stared at the center of the circle. Tobias was gone. He had vanished without a trace, without a sound, just like Finch. The space where he had stood was empty. On the ground, in the exact center of the circle of dead cane, sat the lantern. Its glass was still cracked, but for the first time since that fateful night, its flame was finally, peacefully extinguished. That night, Gideon, a man whose entire being was founded on the principle that every man had a breaking point, a man who believed all mysteries could be solved with the precise application of leverage and pain, packed his single bag. He had encountered a force that could not be leveraged, a mystery that could not be solved, a man who could not be broken but had instead simply erased himself. His logical world was in ruins, his confidence shattered. Without a word to Master Dubois, he mounted his horse and rode away from the plantation, a man defeated not by a physical force, but by an event that his mind would forever refuse to comprehend. His departure broke something in Master Dubois. He had lost an overseer. He had paid a fortune for a problem solver who had fled in the night, and he was now faced with a terrified but strangely unified workforce. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by an awe so profound it bordered on reverence. They had witnessed a miracle. They had seen a man sacrifice himself to save another, had seen him command a power that humbled the master's own. The old lines of division, the whispers of accusation against Tobias had been burned away by that pure white light. They were united now, in their shared secret, in their shared grief, in their shared nascent hope. Dubois looked at their faces and saw not the cowering, broken livestock he was used to, but something new, something he could not control. The reign of casual terror on the Dubois plantation was over. The workloads lessened. The rations were restored. Old Joseph was quietly untied from the post and helped back to his cabin, no longer just an elder, but a living saint, a revered figure of immense respect and authority, the keeper of the true story. And the legend was born. It was whispered in the quarters at night, sung softly in the fields, a powerful story of defiance and hope passed down from parent to child. The story of Tobias Clark, the man who held a lantern against the darkness and did not flinch. He was not remembered as a murderer or a dealer in dark arts, but as a protector, a man who commanded a spiritual fire and paid the ultimate price for his people's salvation. The story of Tobias of Louisiana became a single steady light of its own, a flame of hope that could not be extinguished. Many years later, long after the Great War had come and gone, long after the chains had been broken and the word master was just a bitter memory, an elderly Eliza sat on the porch of a small, neat cabin that was her own. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the same hues of fire and blood, but it was a peaceful sight now. Her freeborn grandchildren sat at her feet, their faces bright with curiosity, listening to the story she had told them 100 times before. She told them the true story of their grandfather, Tobias Clark. She told them of his quiet strength, of his deep love, of the crushed wooden bird, and of the terrible choice he had faced. "He taught us something that night," she said, her voice thin with age but steady with conviction. "He taught us that true power doesn't always come from the fist or the whip or the master's fury. Sometimes the greatest power comes from a single, steady light, held up against an overwhelming darkness. It comes from a love so strong you are willing to become the flame yourself, to burn away the injustice, even if it means you burn away with it." She looked out at the horizon, her old eyes seeing a face in the clouds that only she could see. The final image of the story was not one of vanishing or of supernatural fire. It was the object that sat on the mantelpiece inside the cabin, kept safe and sacred through all the intervening years. The old tin lantern, its glass was spider-webbed with cracks, its metal body dented and worn. It was empty now, its flame long since extinguished. But for the family of Tobias Clark and for the generations that followed, it was not empty at all. It was a holy relic, a tangible symbol of an unbreakable spirit, a testament to a love that had transcended bondage, and a quiet reminder of the man who had walked into a field of darkness and brought forth a legend of light.